I'm Jane Alexander, Nantucket Book Festival alumna, welcoming you to At Home with Authors.
You could say that Crocker Snow Jr. has been writing his latest book about the tiny island of Muskeget ever since his father first flew him there some 70 years ago.
Bingo! There she is.
Crocker Snow Jr. has accomplished a lot in those years. Just a few examples: he served as an officer in the U.S. Navy during the war in Vietnam. He served as a senior foreign correspondent at the Boston Globe. He is currently the coach of the polo team at his alma mater, Harvard. What ties it all together is a spirit of adventure, which is in his blood. His father was a legendary aviation pioneer who, beginning in the 1920s, flew 15,000 hours in 140 different types of planes, often accompanied by Crocker's mother. It was on that private single-engine plane, where he logged 900,000 miles, that Crocker's father first introduced him to Muskeget, beginning a journey that has left him as that island's steward, along with his Boykin Spaniel, Hershey. Always the journalist, Crocker Snow Jr. is a keen observer of the forces of accelerating climate change, which he vividly conveys in the latest edition of his book, Muskeget, Raw, Restless, Relentless Island. He joins us on this episode of At Home with Authors in conversation with fellow adventurer Rob Cocuzzo, author most recently of The Road to San Donato and editor of N Magazine.
So I guess, Crocker, the first time that we met, the circumstances of our meeting, I was writing a story for N Magazine in which we were going to follow Paul Thoreau's kayaking route to get to your island. And we had designs to actually camp out on your island. And it occurred to me as we were drawing these plans together that I'd never gotten permission to actually camp on the island. And so one of the gentlemen that we were kayaking with had done this before. And so he got me your contact information and I reached out, and that's how we touched base, if I'm not mistaken. And then we coincidentally were on the same ferry together. I think that's...
Yeah, I think it's all pretty rough. I mean, pretty roughly right. I use the word roughly to be distinctly. But you did get out there with Kit Noble and somebody else to do something for N Magazine. The photos were great. The writing was great. We had connected beforehand, but once I read it, I took it much more seriously. And I think we did bump into each other on the ferry. And I was looking for a place to camp during the month of December, January in Nantucket to write the book, to be private and be near Muskeget to write the original book about Muskeget. And I ended up in your place, if I remember right.
That's correct, yeah.
And it worked. I was in your garage during the day. The garage is where I did the writing, and it worked out great.
Yeah, and coincidentally, that's where I wrote one of my books too. So that space has good mojo. Whoever's in there now must be cooking up the next great American novel. So, so you and I know Muskeget well. You obviously expertly well. But for those that don't know the island, just give us the geography of where we are relative to Nantucket.
Okay, Muskeget is about 10 to 12 miles west of Nantucket. Nantucket town be 12 miles, Nantucket would be 9 or 10, halfway between Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. It's a very small, uninhabited island, uninhabited with people and uninhabited with trees. There's not a tree on it. So that gives somebody one image of this pretty desolate, very wild, small island.
Right. And the island itself, despite its size, has a pretty remarkable history as it relates to people in Nantucket. Nantucketers being there. Can you just give us in terms of the folks that were on the island, and lead us up to how you and your family literally landed on Muskeget? Like, what were the different uses of it?
I'm sure I don't have the full story, but there were plenty of back in the last part of the 19th century. There were a lot of scallopers that had camps on the western side, the vineyard side of the island, and the eastern half was owned by turned out over time by three gentlemen in Philadelphia who were duck hunters, particularly brant hunters. So it was very well known for that. And there was a long time, a court thing about the town getting full control of the island.
Right.
The town did not come out well in that court thing. And so it was divided sort of formally then between the western half or third being Nantucket owned and the eastern half or third being owned privately. And that evolved over time. And my father was taken out there duck hunting by somebody who ran the Nantucket airport at the time. And the Holgate family, who's very well known in Nantucket, and they both loved the island, shared the island, and Dad asked Alan Holgate then, who owns this, and how might I control, get contact with them. He was given the names of these three elderly men. He used to fly a lot down to Washington. He was a very well-known pilot, and he would stop by Philadelphia technically to get fuel, but he really didn't need it. He wanted to take them out to lunch.
Right.
And he did once or twice and was just said, I loved your island, and at any time you want to get rid of it, I'd be interested. And everybody on Nantucket had said they're never going to sell it, including the Holgates. Well, as things happened within a year and a half, they said, this seems like a nice enough guy, and we can't get out there any longer. So they got in touch with my father and sold it to him for 12 or 12.5, not 120,000, 12,000. And my father was a Yankee too, so he shared it with two other friends. So he ended up paying, I don't know, $4,100 with the agreement that the last living would get the whole ownings of it, and Dad was the last living. And then it came on to me and my brother, and I have 5 sons, and they're all owners now. And it's very, very special to our family. I was dropped there when I was 9 years old by Dad the first time after he had gotten the island, and he dropped me there alone, and it's sort of been nonstop ever since.
And it has a airport there, right? A legitimate.
It's kind of an airport. I helped my father build it, actually, way back when. He was a very, very well-known pilot, and he could get into anything. We had an Avion, and I remember cleaning up this thing in the middle of the island, and there were sand and poison ivy and all this stuff. And we used to fly in and out for a long time from Ipswich, because he was the head of the Aeronautics Commission, but we had a turf runway on his farm in Ipswich, so we'd get on the plane and be down in Muskeget in less than an hour. Over time, that is no longer really functional. I mean,
right.
People are trying to get in and out, and they usually don't get out very cleanly.
Right.
Things have happened. There's much more brush around it now. I still know where it is, and but it's a dicey proposition to go in and out of there now, even though it's called Muskeget International with the FAA.
Yeah.
Which it is.
Because folks do fly over it when they're approaching, depending on where they're coming from, and landing in Nantucket Memorial Airport. But for those that haven't, give us a sense of the ecology there, the landscape. You mentioned there's no trees. You have the only structure on the island, which I think has been moved half a dozen times due to erosion. But give us a description of what this place is like.
Well, the elevator description is that it's about 250 acres. The highest point on the island is a sand dune that's about 17 feet above sea level. As I've said, there's not a tree on it. There's a lot of poison ivy, and there's a lot of bait brush and stuff like that, and there's marshes. So that's one way to describe it. a second way to describe it is that year by year and sometimes storm by storm, the outer landscapes of the island changes all the time based on winds, currents, tides. And that is a characteristic of the island for sure. I don't want to sound too melodramatic here or romantic, but people say, gee, what's it like to own an island? And I always say, yes, we own the island technically, but it's the species there that own the island. And we're witnesses of the species and best case stewards of the species, but we don't own that island at all. Nature owns it. And there's no way to own it because there's so many changes and it's so difficult to get to. No electricity, no running water, and it's truly wild.
I do want to talk about the species because there are some fascinating species that are unique only to Muskeget to discuss. But as far as on this topic of ownership, if we were to say who owned the island, that ownership does change depending on the erosion. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct, because technically Nantucket still owns the western segment of the island, and the island is moving eastward. So I'm a pretty good cartographer. It's moving in our direction. It used to be roughly 50-50, and now I'd say it's 2/3 Snow family, 1/3 Nantucket. We've made a agreement with the Nantucket Land Bank conservation restriction, and they have basically said, look, you guys are great stewards. You control things the way you think is appropriate. They go out maybe once a year, technically, to see if there's been any new buildings or anything like that. Many scientists go out and research people. And it is also a national natural landmark,
right,
which gives it another protection from any outside influences. And I'm very cool with that. And
right.
I feel that the island is protected by those things and the species are protected by those things.
I want to talk about the inspiration behind the book and the purpose of writing it. But to set the scene for folks, tell us about your home there on the island, because it's beyond description in a way. I mean, I've just looked through the windows and some of the items in there are like you would expect to only find on an island with one home on it. Tell us about.
Yeah, I will quickly. Number one, we've had to move the island twice, and it wasn't moved for close to 95 years. And if you hear something in the background, I'm near the turf runway and somebody's on it. But and we've had to move it twice. Phil Marks in Nantucket, who's a great house builder, twice in the last 7 years because of rapid erosion on the southern side. So that's a story in and of itself. But what's inside the camp, there's a bunch of things over the years that have, whether it's old duck decoys or the National Landmark thing, all kinds of memorial and memorabilia from island life, including you may have seen that through the living room, the window, and wondering what it's doing there, but there's a long Texas Longhorn thing in there. My brother-in-law, he was a big party guy, and he said, I'm going to find a party on this island, and I'm going to find some Texas Longhorn, and he got them in there, so we left it there. There's a lot of things inside the camp, even though it's tiny. And sadly now, and it's the biggest problem I get down there each time, is both barn swallows and starlings have gotten into the attic, and I'm doing my very best to keep them out, because particularly starlings make a terrible mess. They only can get into what is technically the garage, but every time we're in there, there's so much iguana to basically shovel out.
Wow.
Takes the first half day of being there. And they're tough. They're really tough. once they've found a place, and it's the only structure left on the island, which you properly said,
Yeah.
it's their only refuge. And they go through shingles if they find a weak shingle, and they'll just get through it. And they found ways under the big storm doors, and that's a problem. You know, it's not a fun thing. It's a pain in the butt.
Yeah.
So that's something new since you looked through the window.
Yeah, I remember also seeing a what looked to be a whale vertebrae serving as an end table, if I'm not mistaken.
Could be. There might be sort of a couple of whale things that we have found there over time, and we didn't go out to look for them. They found us.
I figured that. So let's talk about the book, because it reads in so many different ways. I mean, on one hand, it's this lyrical, it's just beautifully written, kind of a memoir in a way, to this place that served a critical role in your life. And then also it's, you know, this naturalist study of an extraordinary piece of land. When you set out to write this, what was your, driving motivation?
Well, when I set up to write it the first time, I was in your garage. So it was grease and oil. No, I felt that I had seen enough that I ought to record it, simply stated. I'm a journalist, so writing is not a problem for me, but I have another job too, and to get time off to do this, I had to be out of where I live, and I wanted to be in Nantucket, and I ended up in your place. It was a very rough winter, which made it even better. But I wanted to record the island. I was not sure how I would structure the book. And I just started organizing it, and it fell into three places: the species I'd seen, the people I'd seen, and sort of the magic of the place and what would the future might be. Sort of, it came out roughly 5 chapters in each. So I didn't anticipate that in the beginning, in direct answer to your question. And I went back in history. I stopped with the first time I was there at nine years old, but I went a little bit back into history where there were 200,000 terns on the island. And so in the species way, I've seen so much. And scientists keep telling me, you're not a scientist. You're a citizen scientist, because you know more about what we're studying than we do, because you've seen it over many generations. And I guess that's somewhat true. So that was the most exciting thing for me. I know some very good cartographers, one that people in Nantucket may know. His name is Dana Gaines. He lives in the vineyard, and he'd been kayaking to the island, and he did some marvelous maps of how the island has changed every 15 years. And I brought that up to date in the latest book. So I sort of moved into that seamlessly. And I realized that in each subject I wanted to address, there was the reality, what I had experienced with my eyes, and there was a story, or maybe multiple stories that people had told me about or that I'd read about. The island is full of ghosts, and it's full of real and imagined stories of all kinds. And some of those I brought out. A lot of people have approached us to buy the island or to do one thing or another, some nefarious, some not. I brought some of those out. And I was very fearful of Cape Wind, because I was worried not about what Cape Wind, the purpose of it, but if Cape Wind had gone through in the original thing, it was Muskego would be the second closest land to the edge of Cape Wind. And I was very worried about the impact of that, directly and indirectly. So all of those things were in my mind. And as I was writing, more and more things came out. And it came out probably 50% different than I thought it might have 2 months earlier.
Going down through those different chapters, let's talk about species. There's a very unique species that makes its home on Muskeget. Tell us about that. And I'm not asked to talk about gray seals.
Yeah, gray seals is too much. I'd go on for 4 hours. The species you're referring to is technically known as a Microtus breweri, and it's a beach vole, and it is by all biologists and stuff, it is unique to Muskeget. They weren't sure back in the 1880s if it was unique, and they've been convinced ever since it is. And it is a beach vole, but it's somewhat unique in its appearance. Not unique, wrong word, but it looks a little bit different, and it goes on the surface. It can't, most beach voles can go down in the sand or ground, and this one doesn't. It's on the surface. It has been up and down for a long time. It was almost extinct when a couple of the people in the Coast Guard people back in the 1910s got a couple of cats there, and the cats wiped them out, and biologists found 20 still living on a small shoal off the island, and got the cats out and got the Microtus breweri, I call them the Muskeget mouse, back on the island. It's hard to know if you ask me how many are living there now. Best guess is 2,500, but it's a best guess because there hasn't been a real scientist studying them for probably 9 or 10 years. You bump into them periodically. I know the part of the island where there are more than others. They tunnel under the poison ivy, and there's poison ivy everywhere. And there's nothing special about them in one way. A lot of people know about piping plovers, and they sort of look like a piping plover, except they haven't got, they haven't got long feet, and they don't fly or anything of that. But they're sort of that size and somewhat that coloring. I got into it because, number one, it's special. Number two, you and probably a lot of people have read the book way back when called Watership Down about rabbits in England, and it was written in the voice of the rabbits. And I did write a semi-children's book called In the Voice of the Microtus breweri, I call him McCracken. And it was mostly to talk about climate change through the eyes of this tiny little rodent, and what are the challenges and dangers in his or her life. And I had some fun with it. They're very smart, and they go to college underground. I had a lot of fun with it. But things like storms and gray seals and owls, they're threatened by things all the time, like any species. And so I got into it in a way that way. People on Nantucket know of a very good naturalist by the name of Peter Brace.
Yep.
Wonderful book and so forth. Well, I asked him to be one of the people in the last chapter of the new book, the new and revised book, to speculate where Muskeget would be in 30 years, because it's changing so fast. And I got 3 Nantucket people that know the island well, very different, and a couple of others. He ended up focusing on the Muskeget mouse. Peter did. He could have gone in a lot of directions, but and it's very fanciful in a way, but there's some real information there. And so they have that role in our lives that they're pretty special, and keep an eye out for them.
And why should readers that might not have a connection to Nantucket and obviously not a connection to Muskeget, why should they be keeping an eye on Muskeget? What lessons can it be teaching us that can be applied, to the grander scope of the environment?
It sounds almost glib, but it isn't. I think Muskeget represents climate change in a bottle. It's a tiny little ecosystem of 250 acres, and a lot of what I'm writing is directly or indirectly about that dynamic change in a very small place, and how much is climate change, sea rise, is affecting it. So I think the simple answer to your question is that. The more complicated answer is, and I don't know the answer to this, but it is it the climate, is the terrain change and how the island is changing all the time, is that prompting the change of species there that I see all the time, or is it the other way around? Is the change of the species impacting the change of terrain? And it's kind of almost an existential question. And I don't know the answer to it, but it's obvious to me in Muskeget that it's a little bit of both all the time. It's too simple to say it's just tides and currents and winds. That's changing the island. That's too simple. Nothing is simple, even on that island. You can see it all in front of you, but everything is interrelated in ways that we kind of know, but you can't see. Well, this you can if you're looking for it. There's a strange spider there, and it's got its role there for sure. I mean, you just see it if you're open to it, if you're observant.
There's just a quick question on the spiders. Is there black widows there? Because I know there's black widows on Tuckernuck.
I don't think so. And the people at Maria Mitchell do not think so. There is a different spider. They call it, I don't know if it's a nickname or not, they call it the pirate spider. And they've done studies of that on Muskeget. And other people have found more, that's very attentive that you said that, because they found more numbers of different spider species per acre in Tuckernuck and Muskeget than almost any other place.
It's astounding. Another species that we've touched upon, I know we could talk about forever because it's a whole story unto itself, but it is an interesting one with the gray seals. I know that gray seals are, really run amok on the island, and they're protected in part. And correct me if I'm wrong here, is that because Muskeget is surrounded by shallows, they're not necessarily threatened by the great whites you might expect because the water is too shallow for them to get there. What impact have they had on the island? And is there, obviously because they're protected, there's no real deterrent. So how do you see that unfolding in the next 30 years?
Everything you've said is accurate. They were thought, the only background is they were thought to be virtually extinct back in the mid-1960s.
Right.
The first one was found again on Muskeget, and then it's gone up and up, first on Muskeget and now throughout Cape and islands and up to Maine and down to Long Island. To put it in perspective, those who pretty much everybody knows a gray seal is not a harbor seal. The bulls get up to 800 pounds, which is as big as a grizzly bear. They're not small animals. Okay, and I could go into the whole thing about Muskeget, but the bottom line is that they want to be very isolated when they breed and birth. Muskeget is very isolated in the winter, and they want to be protected from their only predator, the great white sharks. Great whites aren't around in the winter, but over time, clearly the gray seals have figured it out, like golf course geese. And why do we have to migrate to Sable Island? We're pretty cool here. Right. And whether they consciously know that there isn't a fin coming their way or unconscious, who knows? But they now get up more than 10,000 in January and February in a tiny little island. And your question was, how are they impacting the island? And there are two or three things obvious. There are so many of them, they go all over the island now when they're giving birth. And they're getting into the freshwater ponds, which they never did before. And biologists say they've never known about gray seals breeding in freshwater ponds. What is the result of that? The result is that 28, 30, 35% of the pups in Muskeget have avian flu. First time ever. And they're passive carriers, but they've never known that in a seal before. And they think and I think the reason why is they're going into the freshwater ponds. That's where wild ducks and geese go. That's where they poop. And that's the process happening. So that's not a positive one. More visible is they are so big and there are so many that they're knocking down the dunes. They're making runs sort of like beaver up in Alaska someplace, except huge ones. And therefore, the beach grass, the marsh grass, various vegetation that protects the island are being knocked down. Some come back, of course, and others don't. Two of the three um, freshwater ponds have now disappeared, primarily because of that. Not exclusively, but primarily. And I wonder, I don't know, but the scientists I talk to say it's a pretty good thought that right now, when you go down there in January or February, it looks like the whole island has been
Yeah,
trashed by bulldozers. I mean, it looks like there's bulldozers everywhere because as they hump around and go more and more inland, and it seems to me that it's pretty obvious that some of the beach bowls, their tunnels on the surface have been flattened. And clearly some of them periodically, I suppose, because they can move fast, particularly the bulls, if they're angry or they want to breed. I think all of those, and there's no question it's temporary. This isn't as, but you asked for the exact impacts. It's very clear to me that wild ducks and geese, if they're working the island, once the seals really get there in numbers, they want to clear out. If they're out in the lagoon and the seals come up, and it's pretty clear that, I don't mean that the seals are going to grab them.
right.
It's just clear that they feel like alien lifestyle is there and it's too tough for them. Let's get the hell out of here. And that's just obvious. Where we go with this, I mean, so many different ways to speculate, but I would go back for one statement and then you can move on. When they first came there were 20 or 25 or 30, and they each had a name. And the scientists would come down, and there's Hazel, and there's Ralph, and he went up to Sable Island, and he's back. Good to see Ralph. And we sort of felt the same way. And all of a sudden, Ralph and his pals went from 20 to 200 and 250. And at roughly that time, I asked one of the scientists, I said, gee, this is really going up rapidly. What is going to be the max here? Where's this going? And they told me very distinctly, there'll never be more than 1,000, because there'll either be disease or there won't be enough food for them. As you now know, there's more than 10,000 during this 3-month period. So the scientists were obviously dead wrong. And therefore, for me to speculate too much, I'm dead wrong enough. I don't want to be dead wrong one more time. But the numbers are not going down, and they're still going up slightly. NOAA is the in Woods Hole are the supervisors of this, so to speak, under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And we have a pretty good relationship now. They were pretty constipated for a long time about how big the numbers of gray seals. They just, because they can't do much about it because of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Now they're much more transparent about it, and I keep a dialogue with a couple of them, and there's even during the pandemic, there is no indication to them that the numbers are plateauing. They think it's still rising. Obviously, and in Nantucket because of Great Point, and more and more in Martha's Vineyard where they weren't, etc.
Yeah, I'd obviously love to ask you more about that, particularly if you ever see the Marine Mammal Protection Act ever being lifted or adjusted to take them off that list.
I think it'll happen.
Yeah.
Slowly. I mean, obviously the fatality off the Outer Cape and now the fatality in Casco.
Yeah,
that's going to prompt, and the fact that so many beaches are closed because of the seals and therefore the great whites.
Right. That's
slowly.
That's a good point. Can you touch upon a little bit of the magic of the place? You said there are ghost stories, or what? Just give us like one little snapshot of what you mean by that.
I mean, there's a lot of different magic. I mentioned that there are ghosts there, and I don't believe in ghosts, but some of the stories that have come up from islanders that I have spent real time checking out are true, including several hundred, I mean, more than several thousand of um, cases of rum being buried on the island after an accident during Prohibition. And the story, I'd heard that my whole life. I've tracked it down. It's absolutely true. There was a gunfight, small gunfight about that, and where that 2,000 rough cases of rum ended up. I was looking for them in your garage, but I couldn't find any. Nobody really knows. They think they know, and it would take me 5 minutes to tell the story fully. That is certainly one. I have it's almost nonstop of different things that have happened unexpectedly. People in Nantucket may or may not have known of a very well-known whale called Pegasus, who was very well known in Nantucket High School, 25 years ago. And I could go on and on about that. I write a whole thing about that in the new book. But that particular whale, I bumped into dead, the carcass, on Muskeget, and nobody knew it, and I didn't know it was Pegasus until 20 years later. I happen to have a acquaintance, more than an acquaintance, I happen to know John Kerry somewhat well from Vietnam and other things. And when he was the Secretary of State living in Nantucket each summer, he and I snuck out to Muskeget over when he was Secretary of State with one Secret Service guy on a Zodiac, and the Secret Service had never been on the sea, and he said, if we get out there and back before 10 o'clock, nobody will know that I'm going out there, and we managed it. Just people, John Kennedy Jr., the one that unfortunately did not have the terrible plane accident, he was kayaking back from the island with me and some others, and we got in a bad storm. I mean, there's an awful lot of different things. And when I say magic, a lot of the magic is dangerous magic, but I think it's good to have some kind of danger in your life, and Muskeget provides it. About that.
Of course. Well, I want to end with a question just on what you like our readers to take away from reading this book, or what do you hope someone will kind of, what's the take home here for them?
Well, number one, buy the book at Mitchell's, because I don't go to Amazon, and the reason why, I want to pay for the book, but that's being petty. I think it's a wonderful question, and I guess I'd say that I want people, particularly if they happen to read the book, that there are special places all around that sustain special life that most of us do not get exposure to. We don't see it, smell it, taste it. And this is such a place. And therefore, if you do get out there, kayaking is tough. Some people do. In the summer, you get there, but respect the island in its complete way. I may end it by saying, because I forgot about it, it's in the last part of the new book. I was out there in Memorial Day weekend. I'd already finished the book, and I was working around, and there were three things I'd never seen before, and I won't go into all three of them, but there were a whole bunch of terns back there, more than 2,000, which is a big deal. They may have come from Iceland, it turns out, which is fascinating. But at the very end of the day, I was walking on an outer beach, and there were all these sea clams, big sea clams, and they'd put in a line probably 10 feet letter, marry me, with sea clams. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, this is pretty fresh. It had to be a pilot, maybe he had a drone, what's going on here? And I figured I could get to the bottom of it it's too difficult to get out there and do something like that. Somebody must have spent 6 hours. And I ended up the book with a picture of that, Marry Me, and which is sort of symptomatic of what I'm trying to tell you about the island. And I will tell you that 6 weeks later, maybe 4 weeks later, I figured out who it was. And it wasn't because I was smart, it's because this particular individual was getting in touch with me because he didn't happen to like some of the things that I might report. And he said, I got a new story for you. And I said, I think I know what it is. And it was this individual, and the fiance was on the phone, not even knowing this would come up, not even knowing at all. And I said, did it work? And he said, yep, we're getting married pretty quickly. So that may be the way to wrap this up.
That's great. Well, the history of this island clearly continues to be written, and I think we're all grateful that you're a steward to that history. So I appreciate the time, Crocker, and let me know when you need to write your next book. I'll get you a place to shack up for the
We got to have a garage that's actually got the rum in it.
Yeah. All right, buddy. Be well, man. Thank you.
Okay, ciao.